All right, welcome everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to this panel on lying and politics. It's sponsored generously by the Hannah Arendt Center, the thinking here at Bard, as well as the Human Rights Program here at Bard. This is another in a series of panels that we're doing, which I call the opportunistic series, in the sense that we have visiting scholars come and use the Hannah Arendt Library here, and we let them do so generously, and we just ask that they pay us back by speaking to us and allowing us to engage with their work. So this came about when Julia Concasallo emailed and said that she'd like to come. She's a Fulbright scholar who's currently at the New School in New York City from Helsinki in Finland. And she's working on a project on Hannah Arendt and the political consciousness consequences of language and the use of language. And she came with her colleague Krista Johansson, also from Finland, also currently doing some work at the New School, visiting at the New School in philosophy. Julia's in political theory. And I asked them what they're working on, and they're working on language, and they said lying and truth, and I thought this would be a great opportunity to have a panel. And so that's how this panel originated. It also didn't escape my mind that one of my students, a senior student at Cornell, was working on a senior project this year on lying in politics. And so I thought this would be a good opportunity for her as well to present some of her work. And then I thought, well, I would call our friend Barry Smith, who's been here a couple times to give lectures on Hannah Arendt at Bard, once at the Arendt conference 2.5 years ago, and once in a human rights lecture series on constitutionalism and Hannah Arendt. So some of these people are familiar to us, some are new. It's very exciting to have them here. Let me just say a couple of things. I've asked them all to speak for about 10 minutes. So we'll have, my hope is that this will allow us to give you a sense of the different ways of thinking about the problems of truth and lying in politics in Hannah Arendt's work. And it will also allow us to have a conversation that we can have amongst each other, and I hope amongst yourselves as well. Basically, what do I want to say as a way of introduction? Simply this, that Arendt always begins, she's written two essays directly on this question, one called Lying in Politics and one called Truth in Politics. And the Truth in Politics essay is actually published in Between Past and Future, but it's only in the second edition, so it's not as well known, because the first edition doesn't have it. But there's another place where she talks about this a lot, which is in the third part of The Origins of Totalitarianism, where she first develops her thinking about the importance of lying and fiction in totalitarianism. And so it's something that goes through her entire life, an interest that goes through her life. And the interest, in a nutshell, is that politics and truth don't go well together, right? No one doubts, she says, that truth and politics are on bad terms. And that's as simple as the fact that politicians lie. But it's also deeper, namely that in order to accomplish anything, in order to unite a people together, to bring a plurality into a unity, in a sense, you're going to have to tell a story and lie in some way. And so lying is the very essence of politics. And that's something she takes away from people like Plato and from Nietzsche, and yet it's also at the very center of much of her thinking. And so all we have to remember is that for her, the question of lying in politics is never a simple one. It's never one of it's bad or good. And it opens up a lot of other questions, which is why we have four great panelists to open those questions and explore them for you. So we're going to start in this order. So first, Barry Smith.
Thanks, Roger. Thanks for inviting me, and thanks to you all for coming. That was a good lead-in, because I'm actually going to start by just raising some questions and paradoxes, and I'll leave it to the more clear-headed and able-minded amongst you to try to resolve the paradoxes and questions, which might sound like a bit of a cop-out, but I think it's appropriate since I'm a political theorist, and Hannah Arendt, as many of you know, famously in an interview with Günter Gauss in 1964, which was televised, and you can see it, but the transcripts are also available in English. she insisted that she's a political theorist, not a philosopher, and he kept calling her a philosopher. And she said, no. He's like, I think you're a philosopher. And she said, well, sorry, that's your problem. I am not. And she insisted that she was a political theorist. And the distinction for her was critical in that she thought political theorists raise paradoxes and questions and seek to understand, whereas philosophers seek finality or answers. And she associates the task of philosophy there and elsewhere with problem solving in a way that interestingly parallels what she says in the essay Lying in Politics about the problem solvers who were responsible, she thinks, for the series of propagandistic bad policies associated with the Vietnam War. She argues that this was the result of a species, something related to the philosophical impulse for finality, which is problem solving, that these even well-meaning policymakers, she thought at times, distorted the truth, spread not only lies, but lies that turned into propaganda, because they were committed to theories that then they applied to the facts of the world in a way that she found reductive. So with that said, I just wanted to begin by just pointing out what I think is kind of the difficult and paradoxical task of calling on Hannah Arendt at all in helping us think through the kind of age-old dilemma, and one that's also particularly politically salient to us now, which I think Cassie will talk about, of when political prevarication or the telling of lies or untruths is justified. That seems to me on its face a maddeningly counterintuitive task in some ways, for, as is well known, Arendt is no fan of truth, at least not truth, capital T. And this is related to what I was just saying in terms of her, preference for the political over the philosophical. As Arendt famously argues over and over again in her work, truth-seeking is an activity proper to the philosophical realm, while opinion formation and debate and deliberation about those opinions is that proper to the realm of politics. And she opposes these in a way that makes it difficult to think about how we could use Arendt's work to try to extract criteria for judgment about when lying is or isn't okay. And so I think more broadly, it's an interesting question for those of us who share Arendt's worry about kind of final or absolutist or monist theories of truth and modes of thinking in that fashion, and yet want to be able to differentiate between types of storytelling and or lying or distortion. So as I noted, Arendt constantly opposes the subordination of the political sphere to that of philosophy. And whereas philosophy attempts to solve problems, as I said, political theorists, she thinks, attempt understanding. So philosophers, she thinks, following Plato, condemn doxa, or opinion, which is the means by which each person has his own opening into the world, she says, right? So in an essay, she argues this throughout her work, but most explicitly probably in the essay Philosophy and Politics, where she makes a really strong distinction between philosophy and politics. And she says that doxa, or opinion, is the way, it's not just, voluntaristic, we each have our own point of view, etc., and they're all equally good. It's not a relativist kind of, conception like that, or a thin conception like interest, but real opinion can only be formed together, but it also is the means by which we each have our own separate opening into the world. So if you quash doxa, or opinion, by asserting truth, and saying truth versus falsity, say, this closes down questioning, she thinks, as well as thus inhibiting public life by quashing kind of the plurality of doxa, or deliberative multifarious points of view with respect to matters of common concern. And as those of you who have read Arendt, and I know a lot of you are taking Arendt seminar, right, with you this term, and many of you, since you're here, I'm sure have read Arendt in other contexts as well, and even if you weren't here, presumably you would come into contact with some of her work, and this is obviously a dominant theme of every single thing she's written, right, is that we need to facilitate the public sphere, a space for plurality, so we can act freely, in that public sphere. And so she's very, very concerned in this essay and elsewhere that a commitment to truth, capital T, will prevent the plurality of viewpoints that's only possible through doxa, or opinion. So, Plato and his modern day ilk, she says, despise opinions and yearn instead for absolute standards. So she associates that with monism, finality, absolutism, sovereignty, totalitarianism, the eradication of human freedom. It's very bad, right, on most readings of her work. Indeed, she goes so far as to argue that the very ability to lie, as Roger was indicating in his opening remarks, is part and parcel of our constitution as free beings. And I know some of you read, I know Roger sent around Truth in Politics, I think, with the infusion of this, and in that essay and in Lying in Politics, she makes that point, right, that lying is actually in some ways characteristic of our natures as free beings, because we tell stories. It's associated with the imagination and with storytelling, the way in which we change and make and remake reality, which she thinks is, is essential to human freedom, or characteristic of human freedom. So this is essential to our ability to act, which is extremely important for her, and to live freely. To look upon politics from the perspective of truth, rather, she writes in Truth in Politics, means to take a stand outside the political realm. So given that, I just want to raise that as a backdrop to thinking about how interesting and complicated these essays are, and how difficult it is to think about, given that, how you would assess differences between kinds of lies, and when lying is okay and when it's not, and what aren't actually, what the grounds are by which and through which aren't could ever condemn lying in politics. So how then are we to understand her concern with the fabrication of reality, or the mass manipulation of fact, about which she writes in these essays? I think that the critical distinction that she makes that might bring us some way towards trying to understand how she ends up so concerned with those, with this kind of fabrication of reality on one hand, and yet abhorrent to absolute standards of truth. The critical distinction that I think she makes is that between rational truth, which, rational or philosophical truth, and she thinks there the opposite is either error or illusion, so representational theories of truth or philosophical absolutist versions of truth, and opinion on the other. So rationalist versions of truth or philosophical ones, she thinks, oppose themselves to either error or opinion. But the other kind of truth, and the one I think about which she's more, much more positive and more ambivalent at least, and more positive in some contexts, is factual truth. And the opposite of factual truth, she says, is the lie, or deliberate falsehood. So she has great reverence in some contexts for facts. So she may not be committed to truth, capital T, but she's still interested in our ability to access, interpret, debate, and deliberate about facts. And so there's, running through all of her work, there is a recurrence to the kind of category of facts to oppose things like propaganda, ideology, etc. But still, opinion and fact still are typically understood, I think, to be at odds with one another. And even in general, our general understanding, I think we think of fact and opinion as not really fully compatible. And even Arendt acknowledges that in these essays that there is a tension between factual truth and politics, or opinion, in that there's an element, she says, of coercion to the ineradicability of factual truth. So every time she wants to say that the facts limit our ability to, propagate this opinion, or et cetera, or the truth will be out, she acknowledges that there's kind of an element of coercion to that. It sets a limit to politics. But I think here, the thing that's key, and the move that she tries to make, I think, in these essays, is to move away from a concern with the lie itself, and towards thinking about the performative nature of lying. So thinking about lying as an act. It's not the lie, and whether it's true or false, which would be the concern of the philosopher, but it's the act of lying and what lying does. Now this opens up another line of paradox, in that she's very explicit that she is a non-consequentialist with respect to politics, right? So this doesn't mean that then we would assess lying in a means-end way, a consequentialist fashion, and say, okay, instrumentally, we're just going to pursue whatever aims or goals, and lying is, if it's a means to a good end, fine, if not. I mean, she's also opposed to that. So, and she says that in these essays, right? And so it becomes very, very tricky. And I mean, the good side of tricky is nuance and interesting. But, so she with Weber thinks that means and kinds of calculations are problematic. And here I think the key is something, this is just my, my intuition. I mean, I think I leave it to you to try to like sort out all these various tensions and paradoxes. But there is, as those of you who've read this essay know, there's a kind of a critical move that she makes where she crafts a sort of historical story of the change in types of lying from earlier forms of lying in politics to modern forms. And here, I think this resonates with what Roger was saying at the beginning about the passages in Origins of Totalitarianism, where she's quite concerned with the fabrication of reality. Because in these essays, there's especially in Truth in Politics, there's a discussion of this sort of shift, where she thinks that lies in politics before were kind of particular and contingent and finite. But in modernity, she seems to imply, lying can become extremely problematic in that it tends to forms of mass deception through the media, propaganda, etc. And it's that kind of mass deception that she thought laid the groundwork for the totalitarian eradication of reality itself, right? The totalitarian limitlessness and fabrication of reality, so that the facts, she talks constantly about the defactualization of the world. So it's not, I think that any particular lie is problematic. I think that she's concerned about the modern, which would just lock her into, again, a kind of truth and error binary, which, to which she's quite like opposed, and worried in general. But instead, she's concerned with the kind of the possibility in modernity of the eradication of our very ability to discern the difference between facts, or reality and the world at all, which then means that we wouldn't have a public sphere, we wouldn't be able to interpret and debate about facts, because facts for her, after all, are still not just cold, bare, self-transparent entities, but they do involve, interpretation and debate and deliberation of plural points of view. So there, then we would lose this, the public sphere or our kind of the world. So I think in that way she tries to keep together in kind of a dialectical or fashion, or just a I don't know if I want to say it's fully dialectical. I mean, I think there's a real tension here, one of which she's fully cognizant, but there's a sort of attempt to, on the one hand, say that politics, as much as she wants to valorize the realm of politics against the realm of philosophy, and the realm of opinion against the realm of philosophy, politics, she thinks, requires limits. And she, in fact, ends this essay with a kind of meditation on that, right? That politics, just like the public world requires constitutional limits, she thinks, within which we can act freely, politics requires limits. And so there's a sort of tension by which, if you try to pursue truth, factual truth too far, you may eradicate politics. But if you pursue politics without attending to facts, you will lose, the facticity of the world, and thus you'll lose the space for politics. So there's a kind of uneasy tension, but one that I think she thinks is constitutive. And as in much of her work, for me, I think her concern is to keep that tension kind of alive and open. But that means that there aren't going to be kind of absolute criteria by which we can judge when lying in politics or political prevarication of various sorts is acceptable or not, and in a predetermined way. So I'll just leave you with that. One more little paradox I can't resist, or not paradox, but problem, just a question. In both of these essays, and especially in Lying in Politics, aren't, I think, surprisingly, and this one was written after this one was written in the wake of the Vietnam War, when the Pentagon Papers were released. Surprisingly, she's kind of optimistic here. There's a strange note of optimism. You'd think that, all of these lies have just come out, mass distortion, etc., of the type about which she's quite concerned, and yet she ends on kind of almost a triumphalist note about, but the facts will out, right? The truth will out, and this demonstrates that we still have people who are willing to expose the truth, and et cetera, et cetera. So it's kind of the triumph of politics and the triumph of facts all at once. And so I guess my question for Cassie and for you is whether she's too optimistic, and or whether we have even more reason to be, pessimistic than Arendt did, or whether, or not. But yeah, my feeling is yes. But I leave it to, to others.